The wedding music had been playing in an endless loop under the bright coastal sun of Newport Beach, California, for far too long. The hired string quartet did not dare to stop moving their bows because absolutely no one had given them the signal, so the melancholy scratching of the violins floated over the 200 white chairs like a broken hourglass. Samuel Vance Montgomery listened to every single note from the very center of the altar, feeling the nervous clearing of throats and the suffocating whispers that spread like thick smoke among the guests who had come to witness his marriage. He gripped the armrests of his wheelchair so tightly that his knuckles turned completely white from the accumulated tension of the disastrous afternoon. It had been quite a while since the bride should have crossed the threshold, but the cobblestone path of the beautiful coastal estate remained entirely deserted under the warm afternoon sky. The impeccably ironed carpet resting on the green lawn showed no footprints whatsoever, and the imposing floral arch, standing much taller than the height of an average man, held hundreds of white roses that were already beginning to wither inevitably under the California heat. Rebecca Adams. Sinclair was nowhere to be found, and judging by the grim expression on the face of Thomas Harrison Fox, the lifelong lawyer approaching quickly from the side, the young woman was never coming back. Thomas was the only man in the entire world whom Samuel trusted with his eyes completely closed, thanks to a loyalty forged over decades of tireless work together. The older lawyer leaned subtly behind the wheelchair, holding a cell phone in his trembling hand, his face looking as pale as a white sheet. He murmured with a voice so low that his words barely brushed the ear of the young corporate executive, warning him that he needed to listen to a voice recording immediately, but begging him to take a deep breath before doing so. Samuel took the small device with a shaky pulse that he himself could not even recognize in that agonizing moment of profound public humiliation. Upon pressing the playback button, the voice that poured out of the small speaker shattered the warm air with a terrifying coldness. It was absolutely not the sweet and affectionate voice that he had learned to love deeply over the past 18 months of their formal courtship. It was a hollow, freezing, and terribly polite intonation that made an irrevocable decision of destiny painfully clear to everyone listening closely. She stated that she simply could not go through with it, begging him not to wait at the altar because she had realized that morning that she was not born to push a wheelchair for the rest of her days on earth. She declared that she was not that kind of woman, and that he did not deserve someone who would say yes, while blatantly lying to the entire world before saying a final goodbye. The phone message cut off abruptly, and an absolute silence fell heavily over Samuel's broad shoulders with the unbearable weight of a massive stone slab. Behind him, the dedicated musicians of the string quartet continued playing the exact same melody out of pure inertia until the groom finally lifted his dark eyes. He commanded them to stop playing right that instant with a tone of voice that dragged an immense heartbreaking bitterness across the lawn. Thomas firmly raised his right hand, and the lead violinist understood the order, immediately cutting the music dead in the middle of the luxurious garden. Without the comforting shelter of the gentle nuptial melody, the murmurs of the 200 guests quickly grew until they became an unbearable tide of indiscretion and hasty judgments. It seemed as though every person present had been eagerly awaiting that precise instant of absolute silence to begin unleashing their tongues, hungry for a fresh scandal. They loudly questioned what had truly happened inside the mansion, whispering about how the poor disabled man had been abandoned, with some women claiming they always knew the beautiful girl would never accept such an immense physical burden. The venomous words reached Samuel from every corner of the vast garden, piercing his dignity like precise arrows of deep contempt. That specific word, poor, was the exact term he had learned to hate with all his strength since that fateful afternoon 5 years ago when a truck with broken brakes left him confined to that rolling chair forever. He was the man who had single-handedly built the massive Montgomery coastal resorts network from one tiny inn inherited from his grandmother Irene, multiplying it across the entire California coast until it became a true financial empire. He, who had signed contracts worth millions of dollars without his hand trembling, a single time was now suddenly reduced to the central object of public pity for the local high society. He closed his eyes for a brief second, desperately trying to contain his boiling rage, and when he opened them, his gaze fell directly upon Chloe Reynolds Matthews. She was standing quietly at the edge of the manicured lawn next to the appetizer table, holding a silver tray full of fresh water glasses with incredible stillness amidst the general chaos of the garden. Chloe had been working at the estate for 30 months, serving morning coffee and organizing the main study with an absolute discretion that had never once been broken. She was the only person on the entire property who had never looked at him with that condescending, pious gaze that everyone else reserved for the chronically ill. Samuel called Thomas over and instructed the lawyer to bring the quiet waitress to the center of the altar immediately, without causing any further scene. Thomas did not ask any questions. After a lifetime of serving the powerful family, he knew exactly when to obey without hesitation. When Chloe stepped up to the wheelchair, she did not bow or look away. She simply stood incredibly straight, with her hands folded, waiting patiently for his instructions. Samuel reached out, took her warm hand in front of the stunned crowd, and softly begged her to pretend to be his bride, just for that day, to save him from complete ruin. Arthur Adams Evans, the wealthy father of the absent bride, marched forward screaming furiously that this was a cheap farce involving a lowly housemaid. However, Chloe straightened her posture with an astonishing dignity, looked the powerful patriarch directly in the eyes, and proudly declared her full name to the crowd. She stated clearly that if Samuel had chosen her, she was the one who had to answer, and she pronounced a resounding yes that left the entire garden breathless. As the guests hesitantly began to applaud, Chloe leaned in and whispered into Samuel's ear that Rebecca was hiding a dark secret that would make him glad the wedding was canceled. The final guest on the aristocratic list finally abandoned the main garden of the coastal estate just as the sun began to hide behind the red roofs of the Grand California mansion. Samuel watched the painful retreat from the enormous window of his private study, tightly squeezing his grandmother Irene's antique silver medallion between his cold fingers. That was an old habit he had kept since childhood. Whenever the ground seemed to shift beneath his feet due to a sudden tragedy, he took out the silver piece and pressed the engraving against his palm until it left a deep mark on his skin. Behind him, Thomas Harrison Fox finished closing the heavy wooden door of the study, turning the brass key twice to ensure absolute privacy. The lawyer announced with the exhausted intonation of a man who has witnessed far too many storms in his career that he had dismissed the string quartet, the parish priest, and the hired photographer. He warned Samuel that by the next morning, the news would be plastered across every entertainment portal and local newspaper in the state of California. He assured his client that by noon, a photograph of the humble service girl holding the wealthy groom's hand at the altar would be circulating everywhere. Thomas dropped his brown leather briefcase onto the mahogany desk with a dull thud that betrayed his profound concern for the future of the corporate empire. He continued to warn Samuel that during the extraordinary morning session of the board of directors for the Montgomery hotels, someone would undoubtedly use this public scandal to demand his immediate replacement as executive president. Samuel remained completely silent, continuing to look out into the garden where the white chairs lay scattered across the lawn, like the physical remnants of an unexpected hurricane. At the far end of the property, right next to the side door of the service area, Chloe stood with her hands crossed in front of her, waiting patiently to be summoned. She had been standing in that exact position for over 40 minutes without showing the slightest trace of physical exhaustion or complaint. Samuel commanded Thomas to bring the young woman into the study, immediately speaking with a firm tone of voice that allowed no room for objection from his old friend and legal advisor. Thomas hesitated for a brief moment, clenching his jaw, as he remembered the enigmatic words the young waitress had whispered into his boss's ear at the empty altar. The lawyer insisted that he needed to be present for the conversation because of whatever secret she claimed to have discovered in the guest wing, but Samuel's unwavering stare forced Thomas to leave the room. Chloe entered the room a moment later, closing the door behind her with the extreme care of someone who has spent years learning not to disturb the air in other people's homes. Samuel offered her a seat on the comfortable leather sofa, but she subtly shook her head and kept her slender fingers intertwined, choosing to remain standing. She explained with admirable serenity that if she sat down in that moment, she feared she would begin to cry from the overwhelming tension, and she absolutely refused to show any weakness on such a difficult day. Samuel nodded with deep respect and sincerely apologized, speaking as a man to a woman, for having used her as a human shield in front of 200 wealthy strangers. Chloe accepted his apology gracefully, confessing that she had agreed to the charade because she saw the exact same brave spark in his eyes that she remembered in her late husband. She revealed that she had been a widow for 5 years after her husband, Jack Bennett Cole, died in a coastal furniture factory accident while saving the life of a younger co-worker. She explained that she carried the heavy burden of financially supporting her mother, Teresa, who suffered from a severe heart condition, and her younger sister, Lily, who desperately dreamed of attending medical school. Hearing her struggles, Samuel proposed a formal pact. She would continue pretending to be his fiancée at high society public events to stop the hostile board of directors from destroying the legacy of his grandmother Irene, who was currently hospitalized. In exchange for her invaluable help, he promised to pay off her family's entire bank debt, cover her mother's expensive cardiology treatments, and fund her sister's university education down to the last textbook. Chloe accepted the incredibly generous proposal, but she established 2 strict conditions that had to be met without question before they proceeded any further. First, she demanded that she be allowed to return to her quiet, humble life the moment the corporate conflict was fully resolved, and second, she insisted on maintaining absolute physical distance in private. Samuel agreed immediately, swearing on his grandmother's memory to honor her terms, which prompted Chloe to finally reveal the massive secret she had been harboring for months. She explained that while cleaning the West Wing, she had found a hidden shoebox under Rebecca's mattress containing confidential documents signed by Arthur Adams Evans. The hidden papers detailed a sinister master plan to sell the entire hotel chain to a foreign conglomerate immediately after the wedding ceremony took place. Chloe explained that she could not read complex corporate jargon, but she understood enough to know that the sale date was set for right after Samuel and Rebecca were supposed to be legally married. Samuel tightly gripped the silver medallion in his hand, realizing with a chilling clarity that the empty altar was not the end of his relationship, but rather the opening move in a massive corporate war. He understood that Rebecca did not leave him because of his wheelchair. She left because the plan to steal his entire life's work had already been finalized behind his back. 4 days had passed since the afternoon of the deserted altar, and the atmosphere at the coastal estate remained incredibly tense, despite the apparent normality of the gardeners pruning the rose bushes near the main entrance. Chloe was staying in her new room in the guest wing, holding a worn, dark leather notebook that had belonged to her mother Teresa for many decades. That old object was filled with ancient family recipes, handwritten poems in pencil, and grocery lists from the most difficult times of her impoverished childhood. However, tucked safely behind the brown paper lining of the back cover, Chloe carefully guarded the 3 typewritten pages she had extracted from Rebecca's shoebox before the bride fled the property. The heavy wooden door of the bedroom slowly swung open, and Margaret Owen, the head housekeeper who had served the Montgomery family for 30 years, walked in holding an elegant blue silk dress. Margaret possessed that indisputable domestic authority that ancient houses grant to those who have swept their hidden corners for decades, having helped raise Samuel since he was an orphaned child. With a falsely affectionate smile that barely concealed a perverse curiosity, the older woman began questioning the young waitress about the intimate details of her sudden relationship with the wealthy boss. Margaret probed to see if Samuel had confided any dark secrets about the coastal family business, or if Chloe had shared any private information with him. Chloe maintained a perfectly neutral expression as she smoothed the blue silk dress over the bed, assuring the housekeeper in a calm voice that Mr. Montgomery had only given her precise instructions for the evening's charity gala. Margaret narrowed her eyes, observing the young woman for a few tense seconds, and patted her arm with an artificial tenderness, before silently leaving the room. Just a few minutes later, Samuel entered the guest quarters in his wheelchair, holding the antique silver medallion outside of his jacket pocket. He looked directly at Chloe and asked her why she had not brought those crucial commercial documents straight to him the very moment she discovered them hidden under the mattress. Chloe looked the businessman straight in the eyes and confessed that she had immediately warned Margaret in the laundry room about the contents of the hidden box months ago. She explained that the head housekeeper had sternly ordered her to keep her mouth shut, claiming that Rebecca was practically family, and threatening to have Chloe blacklisted from every housekeeping job on the California coast. Samuel closed his eyes with profound sorrow, realizing with a heavy heart that the woman his grandmother Irene affectionately called her own daughter in the hallways had become a key piece of the internal treason. The betrayal stung deeper because Margaret lived within the walls of his own home, actively working to destroy his life and his hard-earned heritage. The journey to the El Mirador Convention Center was made in the luxury automobile driven by Thomas, under a sky covered with dense clouds that threatened a coastal storm over the Pacific Ocean. An absolute silence reigned inside the spacious vehicle, broken only when Chloe spontaneously reached out her hand to adjust the silver medallion that was subtly slipping from the pocket of Samuel's tailored jacket. That was not a rehearsed gesture designed for the television cameras, but rather an action charged with an ancient and genuine protection that the lawyer observed closely through the rearview mirror. When they finally arrived at the imposing fortified building on the hill, the harsh reality of social exclusion became painfully evident immediately at the main entrance. The security guard at the front doors rudely indicated that the ramp for disabled guests was located around the side leading directly through the service area of the busy commercial kitchen. That poorly constructed ramp proved exactly how high society equated a wealthy man in a wheelchair with the humble waiters who carried trays of food through the back doors. Chloe adamantly refused to enter through the front door alone, choosing instead to walk proudly by Samuel's side through the bustling kitchen corridors. They navigated between busy cooks and waiters who lowered their heads with silent respect for the couple's quiet dignity, eventually emerging together into the dazzling main ballroom. The grand ballroom of El Mirador sparkled with warm lights, and the constant clinking of fine crystal glasses where Arthur Adams Evans stood alongside his aristocratic wife, Beatrice Adams Sterling. Rebecca did not attend the gala, but her father raised his glass from a distance, flashing Chloe a smile loaded with hidden hostility, before approaching her later to demand a private word on the outdoor balcony. In the dim light of the terrace, the powerful businessman threatened the young waitress, claiming he would use his political influence to remove her mother from the urgent waiting list at St. Lazarus Hospital if she continued her charade. Chloe did not flinch, telling him bravely that her mother was on that list because her heart was tired of life's injustices, not because of his whims. She firmly stated that she washed dirty dishes for a living, but she absolutely refused to wash corrupt consciences like his, advising him to clean up his own mess before threatening a working family. When they returned to the car after the event, Thomas revealed that he had planted a hidden recorder in Chloe's purse, capturing every single word of Arthur's vile extortion on the balcony. Thomas also reported that estate security cameras had caught Margaret meticulously searching Chloe's guest room for 20 minutes while they were at the gala. Chloe simply smiled, tapping the worn leather notebook safely tucked inside her handbag, knowing that the traitor had found absolutely nothing. Arriving at the estate, they were shocked to find Rebecca standing in the rain by the main gate, desperately playing the victim and begging to be let inside. But Samuel coldly sent her away to a local hotel. Early the next morning, Samuel and Chloe traveled to St. Lazarus Hospital to visit grandmother Irene, whose fragile health had significantly declined overnight, according to the urgent reports from the attending nurses. The elderly woman's private room was located on the top floor of the austere white building, offering a serene view of an interior courtyard, where an old palm tree bravely resisted the salty ocean winds. Upon entering the quiet room, the elderly matriarch immediately recognized Chloe's facial features and revealed with a nostalgic warm smile that she had known her mother Teresa many decades ago. Irene explained that she used to run a charitable sewing workshop near the city's bustling port, and Teresa had been her most talented and dedicated student. The grandmother held the young waitress's fingers, firmly recounting how Teresa possessed the finest hands in the entire sewing room, embroidering tiny flowers with a delicate perfection she had never seen in another woman. Irene felt she had never fully repaid Teresa for the beautiful work and time she had given, and she expressed profound joy that life had finally brought Teresa's daughter to her family. Irene then pulled a sealed beige paper envelope from beneath her white hospital pillow and handed it directly to her grandson, instructing him to open it only if the corporate situation became even darker. Chloe stepped out into the quiet hospital hallway to give the family some privacy, sitting on a plastic chair and shedding silent tears as she remembered her mother's difficult past. It was in that precise moment that Thomas suddenly appeared in the hallway, his face completely pale and his expression shattered by a massive revelation he had just received at a nearby cafe. The lawyer hurriedly called Samuel and Chloe together, closing the hospital room door and locking it to ensure absolute privacy before delivering the explosive news that would change their lives forever. Thomas explained that Beatrice Adams Sterling Rebecca's mother had secretly contacted him and requested a private meeting without her husband's knowledge or her usual security detail. With a trembling voice, Thomas read from his leather notepad, revealing that the terrible accident that had paralyzed Samuel 5 years ago was not a random tragedy at all. Beatrice had confessed that she was present when her husband Arthur paid a massive sum of cash to a professional truck driver to intentionally crash into Samuel's car on the steep coastal highway. The sinister goal of the orchestrated collision was to physically disable the young billionaire, forcing him into a state of vulnerability that would make the arranged marriage to Rebecca seem like his only salvation. The room fell into a deathly silence as Samuel pressed the silver medallion hard against his chest, feeling an indescribable physical pain radiating through his entire body as the truth finally washed over him. But the conspiracy planned by the Adams family was even darker and more comprehensive than merely stealing the profitable hotel chain. Thomas continued explaining the master plan. Following the wedding, Arthur intended to use the bribed board of directors to declare Samuel mentally incompetent, citing severe post-traumatic depression stemming from the violent crash. Rebecca, acting as his legally authorized wife, would then sign the papers to commit him indefinitely to a highly secure private psychiatric facility, hidden deep in the interior of the state. While Samuel rotted away in a padded cell, Arthur and Rebecca would completely drain the immense financial assets of the Montgomery hotels, leaving him with absolutely nothing but his despair. Beatrice had remained silent for years out of fear, but seeing her daughter actively participate in the cruel destruction of a good man finally broke her complicity. Samuel sat frozen in his wheelchair for a long time, struggling to breathe as the sheer magnitude of the pure evil directed at him fully materialized in his mind. He then slowly opened the beige envelope his grandmother had handed him moments earlier, pulling out 2 pages filled with Irene's shaky handwritten script. He asked Thomas to read the letter aloud because his own voice was completely choked with emotion. And as the lawyer read, a new layer of astonishing truth was revealed. Irene's letter confessed that she had suspected Arthur's involvement in the crash mere months after it happened, but lacked the concrete proof to destroy him legally. Because she knew the terrible truth, Irene had deliberately forced Samuel to study complex corporate law and placed the company's core assets into an impenetrable trust that only his specific signature could unlock. She had protected him from the shadows for years, refusing to tell him the truth, so that he could continue living his life as a brave man, rather than a terrified victim constantly looking over his shoulder. Samuel covered his face with both hands, breaking down in silent tears as he realized how fiercely the frail woman sleeping in the hospital bed had fought to keep him safe from monsters. Chloe knelt gracefully beside his wheelchair, taking both of his hands and kissing them tenderly, offering him the silent, unwavering strength he needed to finally go to war. The late afternoon sun was beginning to cast long, golden shadows across the mahogany walls of the main parlor at the estate, when Beatrice Adams Sterling arrived without her usual security detail. She held an old brown leather bag in her gloved hands, from which she carefully extracted 2 sealed envelopes and a hardcover notebook bound with a thick, elastic band, placing them on the low table. The aristocratic woman looked Samuel directly in the eyes and confessed, her voice cracking with deep shame, that she would rather see her own family face criminal justice than remain an accomplice to attempted murder. She explained that she had married a cruel man for convenience, and the immense guilt of watching him destroy innocent lives had finally become too heavy for her soul to bear any longer. The first envelope contained the exact names of the 6 corrupt board members of Montgomery hotels, who had accepted massive cash bribes to vote in favor of Samuel's removal for alleged mental incapacity. The second document held the duplicated bank transfer receipts proving the illicit payments made to the truck driver, which Beatrice had secretly copied from her husband's hidden safe during sleepless nights. Finally, the thick notebook contained a detailed, handwritten confession of the entire conspiracy, which Beatrice swore she would ratify before any federal judge in the United States to dismantle the criminal network once and for all. Thomas spent 30 tense minutes verifying the documents, finally confirming that they had enough irrefutable evidence to launch an immediate criminal prosecution for fraud, bribery, and attempted kidnapping against Arthur and Rebecca. Before leaving the estate for the corporate tower the following day, Chloe entered Samuel's private study, holding a very worn black and white photograph she had found inside Rebecca's hidden shoebox months ago. The old image showed a young textile union leader holding a small labor flag, and standing right behind him with a cold, calculating glare was a much younger Arthur Adams Evans. Chloe explained that the young union leader in the photo was the father of her late husband, Jack Bennett Cole, who had been brutally beaten by hired thugs after a labor assembly leaving him permanently crippled. She stated that the working-class families of the port always knew Arthur was the one who ordered the vicious attack, but no one ever had the visual proof to connect him to the crime until now. Samuel carefully packed the historic photograph alongside the damning corporate evidence, realizing that the quiet waitress had provided him with the ultimate weapon to destroy Arthur's false public reputation. The legal team traveled swiftly to the top floor of the corporate skyscraper in the center of the coastal city to attend the extraordinary emergency session of the board of directors. The board members entered the massive meeting room with the fake, hurried politeness of people trying desperately to hide their intense nervousness behind practiced corporate greetings. Arthur and his daughter Rebecca arrived last, acting incredibly arrogant and confident, because they still falsely believed they controlled the voting majority of the massive hotel chain. Samuel rolled his wheelchair to the head of the long wooden table, positioning Thomas to his left, and proudly placing Chloe to his right, in the seat traditionally reserved for the executive president's official partner. Without raising his voice a single time, Samuel methodically presented the devastating evidence over the next 20 minutes, completely freezing the atmosphere in the giant corporate boardroom. He announced the legal injunction freezing the company's sale, read aloud the names of the 6 bribed directors, and finally presented Beatrice's sworn confession detailing the horrific accident and the psychiatric plot. The faces of the conspirators turned completely white with terror, and the room descended into absolute chaos when Thomas placed the old Union photograph directly in the center of the table. Eleanor Vance Carter, an honorable elderly board member, leaned forward and immediately recognized the Union event in the photo, remembering the terrible unpunished crime at the port from a quarter of a century ago. The revelation of Arthur's violent history disgusted the remaining honest members of the board, who physically pushed their heavy chairs away from him in a powerful display of absolute rejection. Rebecca desperately tried to speak to defend herself, but Thomas sharply cut her off, stating firmly that she would have to save her pathetic lies for the federal prosecutors. Samuel then raised his hand and granted the floor to Chloe, stating that she had more right to speak the final words in that room than any wealthy shareholder present. Chloe stood up, slowly placed her hands on the polished table, and delivered a speech so powerful and true that the entire room held its breath. She told them that the invisible people who serve water and wash dishes see absolutely everything that the wealthy elites try so desperately to hide in the shadows. She declared that she had not come to humiliate anyone, but simply to return the piercing gaze they never thought would look back at them, proving that the working class carries the ultimate truth. Eleanor Carter was the first to applaud, and soon the entire room joined in. Arthur was escorted out by security, the corrupt members signed their resignations, and Eleanor offered to pay for Lily's entire medical education. On the drive back to the estate, Samuel received an urgent phone call from the director of St. Lazarus Hospital, who reported that grandmother Irene had miraculously woken up with a sudden burst of energy. The director explained that the elderly matriarch was repeatedly asking for a wedding ceremony to take place at a specific small chapel before she finally let go of this world. Hearing this, Samuel closed his eyes, and Chloe instinctively placed her hands over her mother's old leather notebook, sensing that their long battle was finally coming to a beautiful end. That night, Samuel made a secret phone call to arrange everything for the following morning, ready to honor his grandmother's dying wish and claim the life he truly deserved. The pale light of dawn broke over the California coast as Samuel Vance Montgomery left the estate with Thomas Harrison Fox, driving the luxury vehicle toward the poorer neighborhoods of the port. The antique silver medallion of his grandmother Irene rested safely in the breast pocket of his tailored suit, pressing warmly against his beating heart as they navigated the quiet morning streets. They stopped at a humble house where the salty ocean breeze had chipped the paint away. Finding Teresa Matthews waiting at the front door, supported by the strong arm of her youngest daughter, Lily. Samuel rolled his wheelchair out of the car, took Teresa's worn hands in his own, and explained that his grandmother wanted to ask for her forgiveness and witness his marriage to Chloe at a small chapel. Teresa looked deeply into Samuel's eyes, seeing a bright light of genuine love and profound respect that poverty and illness had not been able to extinguish from her own soul. She smiled gently and told the young billionaire that if her brave daughter had accepted him in front of 200 strangers without knowing his true worth, she would certainly accept him now in the light of truth. Meanwhile, back at the coastal estate, Chloe received Margaret Owen in the main study, sitting proudly behind the massive desk with her mother's leather notebook resting comfortably on her lap. Chloe calmly informed the traitorous housekeeper that out of respect for Irene's memory, she would not call the police, but ordered her to pack her bags and leave the property forever without saying another word. The Chapel of Our Lady of the Bay was a beautiful small stone building situated at the end of a long dirt road, surrounded by massive ancient oak trees that filtered the morning sunlight. There were no flashing cameras, no gossiping high society guests, and no corrupt corporate board members. There were only the few honest people who truly mattered in their lives. Grandmother Irene arrived in a specialized medical ambulance authorized by the hospital director, and the paramedics carefully wheeled her stretcher right up to the altar so she could witness the ceremony clearly. Chloe walked down the rustic aisle supported on her left by her mother Teresa, and on her right by her sister Lily, carrying a simple branch of fresh jasmine from the estate's garden instead of an expensive bouquet. Before the priest could begin the sacred vows, Irene weakly raised her thin hand and asked for a brief moment to speak directly to the mother of the bride. The elderly matriarch apologized to Teresa for never fully paying her what she was truly worth during those difficult days at the sewing workshop at the port so many decades ago. Teresa stepped forward, kissed Irene's fragile hand, and whispered that there was absolutely nothing to forgive, because those sewing classes had given her rare moments of pure happiness during a very hard life. The two older women shared a profound look of mutual understanding, realizing that God had perfectly woven their difficult paths together to unite their children in a beautiful and unbreakable bond. Samuel took Chloe's hands and delivered his vows with a slow, steady voice, telling her that he had chosen her in his darkest hour, because her soul had already become his true home. He promised her that his wheelchair was nothing more than a piece of furniture, and that together her strong legs and his resilient spirit would carry them through any storm the world could throw at them. Chloe responded with a calm certainty, declaring that being truly seen by a good man was worth infinitely more than being superficially desired by the rest of the world. She presented her mother's worn leather notebook as her only dowry, promising to walk faithfully by his side. And they shared their first real kiss as the wind gently rustled the leaves of the old oak trees. Grandmother Irene passed away peacefully in her sleep a few weeks later, knowing her beloved grandson was finally safe, and she left her silver medallion to hang proudly around Chloe's neck. Arthur Adams Evans was aggressively prosecuted by the federal justice system and sentenced to a lengthy term in federal prison, while Rebecca was exiled to a miserable inland town where no one knew her wealthy last name. The hotel company flourished massively under the ethical guidance of the newly reformed board, and Lily passed her medical school exams with the highest possible honors, keeping her mother's old notebook on her office desk. One warm afternoon, Samuel stood up from his wheelchair and took 2 miraculous steps supported by his therapist, while Chloe watched from the doorway, with a loving smile, her hands resting on her gently rounding pregnant belly. Years later, a beautiful little girl named Irene played happily in the lush gardens of the estate, possessing the exact same clear blue eyes as the brave bisabuela who had saved them all. For those who have walked a long path and carry the winters of bitter experience in their graying hair, life eventually reveals that true strength is never built with cold marble blocks or massive corporate empires, but with the invisible resilient threads of absolute sincerity and divine justice. The most cruel and devastating storms of human existence do not possess the real power to tear down the foundations of a home built on moral truth. Instead, their only true function is to clear the ground, washing away the sterile weeds of vanity and the dark betrayal that so often masquerades as false affection. Pity from wealthy strangers is merely a cheap, worthless coin, the foolish handout to quiet their own guilty consciences. But genuine understanding is a rare and sacred sanctuary that only truly noble souls are capable of offering during moments of profound physical vulnerability. At the very end of the difficult journey, when the loud applause fades and the grand glittering halls stand completely empty under the fading twilight, the greatest fortune a mature person can possess is simply holding the warm hand of someone who saw their spirit completely intact when the rest of the world only saw the broken pieces, proving that the universe always weaves its perfect justice with an infinite and quiet patience.